70 years ago, 8-year-old Anna Miller vanished from St. Mary's Orphanage in Boston after attending evening prayers, leaving no traces behind. Her disappearance, along with 6 other children over 18 months between 1952 and 1954, plunged the Catholic community into tragedy and the remaining orphans into paralyzing fear. The police considered various possibilities: runaways, kidnapping, trafficking, but couldn't solve the crimes, causing outrage among the few relatives and community members who never lost hope. Fighting for the truth to surface, they demanded answers that would remain buried for 7 decades. Before continuing, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. Anna Miller arrived at St. Mary's Orphanage in the autumn of 1951, after her parents died in a house fire in Dorchester. She was a quiet child with auburn curls and freckles scattered across her pale cheeks, known for her love of drawing biblical scenes during art time. Sister Margaret Catherine, the head nun, often praised Anna's devotion during evening prayers, noting how the little girl would clasp her hands tighter than the other children, as if pleading for something only she could understand. The orphanage, established in 1923, housed approximately 40 children at any given time. Built from red brick and surrounded by tall iron gates, St. Mary's occupied an entire city block in South Boston. The building's Gothic architecture cast long shadows across the courtyard, where children played during their limited recreational hours. Father Thomas O'Brien, the orphanage chaplain, conducted daily mass in the small chapel adjacent to the main building, his deep voice echoing through halls that would soon become silent witnesses to unthinkable crimes. During the harsh winter of 1952, Anna began experiencing nightmares. She would wake screaming about dark rooms and men in black robes, disturbing the other girls in Dormitory 3. Sister Margaret Catherine attributed these episodes to trauma from losing her parents, prescribing additional prayer time and isolation as remedies. The nun's journal, discovered decades later, contained troubling entries about Anna's spiritual struggles and her need for special guidance from Father O'Brien. The first sign of danger came on February 14, 1952, when 7-year-old Timothy Walsh disappeared after attending private confession with Father O'Brien. The boy's bed remained untouched the following morning, his few possessions, a wooden cross and a photograph of his deceased mother, left behind as if he had simply evaporated. Sister Margaret Catherine reported Timothy as a runaway to the Boston Police Department, claiming he had expressed desires to find his extended family in Ireland. Detective Patrick Murphy, assigned to the case, found the explanation suspicious. Timothy was known among the children as particularly fearful of the outside world, having never ventured beyond the orphanage gates since his arrival 2 years prior. The boy's terror of abandonment made a voluntary departure seem impossible. However, Murphy's investigation was hampered by the orphanage's insistence on maintaining privacy and the church's considerable influence over local authorities. Within 6 months, 3 more children vanished under similarly mysterious circumstances. Mary Elizabeth Santos, age 9, disappeared after helping Sister Margaret Catherine with evening inventory in the basement storage rooms. 10-year-old Robert Chen vanished following a private meeting with visiting church officials. 8-year-old Sarah Williams was last seen walking toward Father O'Brien's quarters after being selected for special religious instruction. Each disappearance followed an identical pattern. The child would be called for individual attention by either Father O'Brien or Sister Margaret Catherine, then simply cease to exist. No personal belongings were taken, no notes were left, and no witnesses came forward. The remaining children grew increasingly fearful, whispering rumors of a hungry darkness that swallowed the chosen ones during the night. Anna Miller's turn came on October 31, 1952, Halloween night. Sister Margaret Catherine approached her during evening meal, informing Anna that she had been selected for advanced catechism lessons with Father O'Brien. The little girl's face drained of color as she was led away from the dining hall, her auburn curls bouncing with each reluctant step. Several children later testified to hearing Anna's voice echoing from the chapel basement around midnight, calling for her deceased parents in a tone of absolute desperation. By morning, Anna Miller had joined the ranks of the vanished. Her bed was perfectly made, her nightgown folded neatly on the pillow, as if she had prepared for a journey she knew she would never return from. The only trace of her existence was a crude drawing left on her desk, a picture of children standing in a dark room, surrounded by tall figures in black robes, with the words, "Help us," scrawled in crayon across the bottom. The final disappearance occurred on December 12, 1954, when 6-year-old Michael Rodriguez vanished after being chosen for the orphanage's annual Christmas pageant. His absence marked the end of the mysterious vanishings, though the trauma would haunt St. Mary's for generations. The orphanage closed its doors permanently in 1958, citing declining enrollment and financial difficulties, but the real reason remained buried in sealed church documents and terrified whispers. Detective Patrick Murphy refused to accept the official narrative of runaway children, despite mounting pressure from church officials and his own superiors to close the cases. The veteran investigator, himself a Catholic, couldn't reconcile his faith with the growing evidence that something sinister was occurring within St. Mary's walls. His persistence would cost him his career, but ultimately preserve crucial evidence that would prove invaluable 7 decades later. Murphy's investigation revealed disturbing patterns that church officials desperately tried to suppress. Financial records showed unusual payments to the orphanage from unnamed benefactors, always coinciding with the children's disappearances. Transportation logs indicated vehicles arriving at St. Mary's during late-night hours, despite the orphanage's strict curfew policies. Most troubling were the medical records, which showed all vanished children had recently undergone comprehensive health examinations, their files marked with cryptic symbols that medical professionals couldn't explain. The detective's breakthrough came through Margaret O'Sullivan, a former kitchen worker at St. Mary's, who approached him in secret 3 months after Anna Miller's disappearance. Margaret, a devout Catholic mother of 4, claimed she had witnessed children being escorted to the basement levels of the orphanage during the night shift. She described seeing Father O'Brien and Sister Margaret Catherine leading groups of children through corridors she had never seen before, areas that seemed to extend far beyond the building's official blueprints. Margaret's testimony revealed the existence of underground chambers beneath St. Mary's, accessible through a hidden entrance behind the chapel altar. She described hearing strange sounds emanating from these depths, children's voices mixed with adult conversations in languages she couldn't identify. On one occasion, she claimed to have seen men in expensive suits entering these hidden areas, carrying briefcases and speaking in hushed tones about placements and selections. Murphy's attempts to obtain search warrants for the orphanage basement were consistently blocked by corrupt officials in the Boston Police Department, many of whom had financial ties to the Catholic Church. His requests for backup during unofficial investigations were denied, forcing him to work alone during his off-duty hours. The detective's personal notes, preserved in his family archives, reveal his growing frustration with a system designed to protect institutional power rather than vulnerable children. The investigation took a dangerous turn when Murphy began receiving anonymous threats, warning him to abandon his pursuit of the missing children cases. His car tires were slashed, his home telephone was wiretapped, and strange men began following his family members. Despite these intimidation tactics, Murphy continued gathering evidence, secretly photographing suspicious activities around St. Mary's and documenting witness testimonies that official reports ignored. Father Thomas O'Brien's background check revealed a troubling history that church officials had deliberately concealed. The priest had been transferred from 3 previous parishes following unexplained incidents involving missing children and financial irregularities. His personnel file, partially recovered decades later, contained references to special ministries and confidential assignments that required direct approval from Vatican authorities. These cryptic notations suggested O'Brien's role at St. Mary's was far more complex than a simple chaplain position. Sister Margaret Catherine's past proved equally suspicious. Born Maria Kowalski in Poland, she had arrived in the United States in 1949 with falsified immigration documents and a history that began only when she joined the convent. Her medical training, unusual for a nun of that era, included specialized knowledge of pharmaceuticals and child psychology. Former colleagues described her as unusually secretive and noted her frequent private meetings with visiting church officials who never appeared on official visitor logs. Murphy's investigation uncovered a network of corruption extending far beyond St. Mary's Orphanage. Boston city officials, police commanders, and prominent businessmen were all connected through financial relationships with Catholic institutions. The detective's findings suggested a coordinated effort to suppress information about the missing children, involving individuals at the highest levels of local government and law enforcement. The case files revealed that other Catholic institutions across New England had experienced similar disappearances during the same time period. Murphy identified patterns suggesting a coordinated operation involving multiple orphanages, convents, and schools. Children were being systematically selected based on specific criteria, those without living relatives, exceptional health records, and particular physical characteristics. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than anyone had imagined. Murphy's career ended abruptly in 1955, when he was forced into early retirement following accusations of mental instability and inappropriate conduct. His badge was revoked, his pension reduced, and his reputation destroyed through whisper campaigns, orchestrated by corrupt superiors. However, Murphy had anticipated this outcome and secretly preserved all evidence related to the St. Mary's cases, hiding documents in a safety deposit box that wouldn't be discovered until after his death in 1987. The detective's final report, written shortly before his forced retirement, concluded that the missing children from St. Mary's Orphanage were victims of an organized trafficking network operating under the protection of powerful religious and political figures. His evidence suggested the children were not murdered, but relocated for purposes he couldn't definitively prove. This assessment would prove prophetic when Vatican documents finally surfaced 70 years later, revealing the true scope of the crimes committed within St. Mary's walls. The few relatives of the vanished children lived in a perpetual state of anguish, torn between hope and despair as years passed without answers. Anna Miller's aunt, Dorothy Peterson, exemplified this torment, spending her life savings on private investigators and psychics, clinging to any possibility that her niece might still be alive somewhere in the world. Her dedication to finding Anna would consume 5 decades of her life, ultimately leading to crucial discoveries that investigators had overlooked. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested to know which places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. Dorothy Peterson had been Anna's only surviving relative, a unmarried schoolteacher who had desperately wanted to adopt her niece after the house fire claimed Anna's parents. However, social services determined that St. Mary's Orphanage provided better resources for a traumatized child than a single woman's modest apartment. This decision haunted Dorothy for the rest of her life, filling her with guilt and an obsessive determination to find Anna at any cost. After Anna's disappearance, Dorothy visited St. Mary's weekly, demanding updates and questioning staff members about her niece's whereabouts. Sister Margaret Catherine initially received these visits with feigned sympathy, assuring Dorothy that the church was doing everything possible to locate Anna. However, as Dorothy's questions became more pointed and her investigations more thorough, the nun's attitude shifted to barely concealed hostility. Dorothy was eventually banned from the orphanage premises, with church officials obtaining a restraining order that prohibited her from contacting St. Mary's staff. The prohibition only intensified Dorothy's determination. She hired 3 different private investigators between 1953 and 1960, spending her teacher's salary and her parents' inheritance on the search for Anna. Each investigation yielded tantalizing clues: reports of children matching Anna's description in distant cities, mysterious transportation records, and coded communications between Catholic institutions, but no concrete evidence of her niece's fate. The investigators faced the same institutional resistance that had stymied Detective Murphy, with church officials citing privacy concerns and legal immunity. Timothy Walsh's grandmother, Bridget Walsh, traveled from Ireland to Boston in 1953, determined to find her grandson or at least understand what had happened to him. At 73 years old, Bridget possessed the fierce determination of a woman who had survived the Irish War of Independence and the Great Depression. She camped outside St. Mary's Orphanage for weeks, approaching staff members as they entered and left the building, demanding answers about Timothy's disappearance. Bridget's investigation uncovered disturbing inconsistencies in the orphanage's story. She discovered that Timothy had been scheduled for adoption by a family in Maine just days before his disappearance, yet this information had never been shared with police investigators. The adoption paperwork mysteriously disappeared from church files, and the prospective adoptive family claimed they had never heard of Timothy Walsh. Bridget suspected that someone had deliberately sabotaged the adoption to keep Timothy available for whatever sinister purpose had claimed him. Mary Elizabeth Santos's uncle, Roberto Santos, organized the first coordinated effort by families to demand justice for the missing children. As a World War II veteran and skilled mechanic, Roberto possessed organizational abilities and military contacts that other relatives lacked. He established a support group for affected families, pooled resources for professional investigations, and lobbied government officials to reopen the cases that police had prematurely closed. Roberto's group documented striking similarities in the children's disappearances that individual investigations had missed. All vanished children had been recent arrivals at St. Mary's, having lived at the orphanage for less than 2 years. Each child had exhibited exceptional intelligence or artistic abilities that set them apart from their peers. Most significantly, all had undergone recent medical evaluations that included unusual procedures not typically performed on orphaned children, such as extensive blood work and psychological assessments. The family's investigations revealed a pattern of witness intimidation that extended far beyond Detective Murphy's experience. Former orphanage employees who attempted to speak with relatives were fired from subsequent jobs and faced harassment that forced many to relocate to different cities. Margaret O'Sullivan, the kitchen worker who had assisted Murphy's investigation, disappeared in 1956 along with her entire family, leaving behind only a hastily abandoned apartment and terrified neighbors who refused to discuss their departure. Robert Chen's adoptive American family, the Williamses, had brought the boy from China as an infant and placed him at St. Mary's temporarily while dealing with immigration complications. They possessed extensive documentation of Robert's background, including medical records and photographs that contradicted the orphanage's claims about his origins. The Williamses discovered that St. Mary's had falsified Robert's intake records, listing him as an abandoned American-born child, rather than acknowledging his Chinese heritage and legal adoption status. The falsified records suggested a deliberate effort to erase the children's identities and histories, making them easier to relocate without detection. The Williamses' legal challenge to these falsifications was blocked by church attorneys who claimed religious exemption from standard record-keeping requirements. Their persistence led to death threats and financial ruin as their small business was systematically destroyed through mysterious accidents and lost contracts. Sarah Williams' older sister, Catherine Williams, had aged out of St. Mary's just months before Sarah's disappearance. Catherine had witnessed disturbing activities during her final weeks at the orphanage, including late-night visits by well-dressed strangers and secret meetings in areas typically off-limits to children. Her attempts to protect Sarah by requesting her sister's transfer to a different facility were denied by Sister Margaret Catherine, who claimed that separation would be traumatic for the younger girl. Catherine's testimony provided crucial insights into the selection process for disappeared children. She observed that chosen children were often isolated from their peers for weeks before vanishing, subjected to additional medical examinations and private counseling sessions. The selected children exhibited increased anxiety and behavioral changes, suggesting they were aware of their impending fate. Catherine's detailed accounts of these pre-disappearance patterns would prove essential to understanding the perpetrator's methods when investigators finally gained access to sealed church documents decades later. Michael Rodriguez's foster mother, Elena Rodriguez, had been in the process of officially adopting him when he vanished from St. Mary's. The legal complications surrounding his disappearance trapped Elena in a bureaucratic nightmare that prevented her from pursuing independent investigations. Church officials claimed that incomplete adoption procedures left Michael's custody status unclear, effectively rendering Elena powerless to demand answers about his fate. Her legal battles consumed years and left her financially devastated, yet she never stopped searching for the boy she considered her son. The institutional conspiracy to suppress evidence of the missing children extended far beyond St. Mary's Orphanage, involving corrupt officials, intimidated witnesses, and a systematic destruction of records that would hamper investigations for decades. Church authorities coordinated with local government officials to ensure that any evidence threatening their reputation would disappear as completely as the children themselves, creating a wall of silence that seemed impenetrable. The Boston Archdiocese's response to the growing scrutiny revealed the calculated nature of the cover-up. Cardinal Richard Cushing, the powerful leader of Boston's Catholic community, personally intervened to protect St. Mary's reputation, threatening excommunication for any Catholic who cooperated with secular investigations. His private correspondence, discovered in Vatican archives 70 years later, contained explicit instructions for destroying potentially incriminating documents and relocating personnel who possessed sensitive knowledge. Financial records from the Boston Police Department showed unusual budget allocations during 1952-1954, with substantial sums directed toward special investigations that produced no documented results. Detective Murphy's superiors received mysterious promotions and pay increases during this period, coinciding with their efforts to suppress his investigation. The corruption extended to the district attorney's office, where prosecutors consistently declined to pursue criminal charges despite mounting evidence of wrongdoing. Sister Margaret Catherine's personnel file underwent multiple revisions during 1954, with entire pages removed and replaced with sanitized versions that omitted any reference to her suspicious activities. Her medical training records were altered to minimize her qualifications, making her appear less capable of the sophisticated operations Murphy had uncovered. These falsifications were so extensive that they created contradictory information within the same document, revealing the hasty nature of the cover-up efforts. The orphanage's architectural plans were mysteriously lost from city records during 1955, making it impossible for future investigators to verify Murphy's claims about hidden basement chambers. Building permits for St. Mary's construction in 1923 showed standard orphanage facilities, with no indication of the extensive underground areas that witnesses had described. However, utility connection records revealed electrical and plumbing installations far exceeding the needs of the documented building plans, suggesting the hidden chambers were part of the original construction. Father O'Brien's transfer to a remote parish in New Mexico occurred suddenly in January 1955, just days before Murphy's forced retirement. The priest's departure was accompanied by the destruction of his personal office and the removal of all records related to his tenure at St. Mary's. Church officials claimed that O'Brien had requested the transfer for health reasons, but medical records showed no indication of illness or disability that would necessitate such a dramatic relocation. The systematic intimidation of potential witnesses reached beyond direct threats to encompass economic warfare against anyone who challenged the official narrative. Businesses owned by families of missing children experienced mysterious fires, failed inspections, and lost contracts that drove many into bankruptcy. Dorothy Peterson lost her teaching position after 30 years when school administrators received anonymous accusations of mental instability related to her obsession with finding Anna. Margaret O'Sullivan's disappearance in 1956 followed a pattern of escalating pressure designed to silence her testimony. Her husband's construction company lost several major contracts simultaneously, forcing the family into financial distress. Strange men began watching their children's school, and anonymous phone calls threatened harm to her family if she continued cooperating with investigators. The night before Margaret planned to meet with a journalist investigating the St. Mary's cases, the O'Sullivan family vanished completely, leaving behind only a note claiming they were relocating for better opportunities. The medical examiner's office participated in the cover-up by refusing to investigate suspicious deaths connected to the St. Mary's cases. 3 individuals who possessed potentially incriminating information died under questionable circumstances between 1954 and 1957. A former maintenance worker who claimed knowledge of the hidden chambers, a social services employee who had questioned the orphanage's procedures, and a newspaper reporter who had been investigating connections between missing children cases across New England. City planning records were altered to show that St. Mary's Orphanage occupied a smaller footprint than its actual dimensions, supporting official denials about underground facilities. Surveyors who attempted to verify the building's true size faced harassment and equipment sabotage that made accurate measurements impossible. Aerial photographs of the orphanage from the 1950s were removed from public archives and replaced with images that concealed evidence of construction activities and unusual structural features. The conspiracy extended to federal authorities through connections between Boston's Catholic hierarchy and powerful political figures in Washington. Immigration records for Sister Margaret Catherine and several other St. Mary's staff members were classified at the highest levels, preventing investigators from verifying their backgrounds or tracking their movements. FBI files related to the missing children cases remained sealed for decades, with officials citing national security concerns that seemed disproportionate to a local crime investigation. The destruction of evidence reached its peak in 1958, when St. Mary's Orphanage was demolished rather than sold or converted to other uses. The demolition occurred with unusual speed and thoroughness, with all materials buried in sealed landfills rather than recycled or salvaged. Construction workers reported finding unusual chambers and tunnels during the demolition, but they were sworn to secrecy and paid substantial bonuses for their silence. The demolition contracts were awarded to companies with direct ties to Catholic institutions, ensuring that any discoveries would be suppressed. The final element of the cover-up involved the systematic relocation of surviving witnesses and potential informants to distant locations where they could be monitored and controlled. Former St. Mary's employees received generous pension packages and attractive job offers in remote parishes, effectively removing them from Boston and limiting their contact with investigators. Children who had lived at the orphanage during the disappearances were placed in foster homes across multiple states, making it nearly impossible to gather coherent testimony about their experiences. The 1960s brought a deliberate campaign of erasure as the Catholic Church worked systematically to remove all traces of the St. Mary's scandal from public memory. Official histories of Boston's Catholic institutions omitted any mention of the orphanage, while newspaper archives were purged of articles related to the missing children cases. The conspiracy of silence was so complete that by the end of the decade, even many Boston residents had forgotten that St. Mary's Orphanage had ever existed. The social upheaval of the 1960s provided perfect cover for the church's memory suppression efforts. As American society grappled with civil rights movements, Vietnam War protests, and generational conflicts, the fate of 7 orphaned children from the previous decade seemed increasingly irrelevant to public discourse. Church officials deliberately timed their final evidence destruction to coincide with major news events that would dominate public attention and overshadow any investigative reporting about the missing children. Dorothy Peterson's search for Anna Miller became increasingly desperate as leads evaporated and witnesses disappeared or died. By 1965, she had exhausted her financial resources and faced growing social pressure to abandon her quest. Fellow teachers avoided her company, viewing her obsession with Anna's fate as evidence of mental instability. Dorothy's principal suggested that she seek psychiatric treatment, threatening her employment if she continued disrupting the school environment with her investigations and emotional outbursts. The few journalists who had shown interest in the St. Mary's cases found their career prospects damaged by mysterious editorial decisions and advertiser pressure. Articles about the missing children were killed before publication, and reporters who persisted in pursuing the story were reassigned to less sensitive beats or fired outright. The Boston Herald's investigative team, which had been developing a comprehensive exposé of the conspiracy, saw their research materials destroyed in a convenient office fire that consumed only their files while leaving surrounding documents untouched. Roberto Santos's family support group gradually dissolved as members faced escalating harassment and financial pressures. Several families relocated to other states, hoping to escape the intimidation and start fresh lives. Those who remained in Boston found themselves increasingly isolated, with former friends and neighbors avoiding contact out of fear or social pressure. The group's final meeting in 1967 included only 3 family members, and their attempt to hire a new private investigator was thwarted when no reputable firm would accept their case. The 1970s brought a new generation of Catholic leadership that seemed genuinely unaware of the St. Mary's scandal, suggesting that the cover-up had been so effective that institutional knowledge of the crimes had been successfully erased. New priests and nuns assigned to Boston parishes expressed confusion when asked about the missing children, claiming no knowledge of any such incidents. This ignorance appeared genuine rather than feigned, indicating that the conspiracy had achieved its goal of complete suppression. During this period, several attempts were made by amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts to research the St. Mary's cases, but they encountered the same barriers that had stymied professional investigators. Public records had been sanitized, witness testimony was unavailable, and physical evidence had been destroyed. The few remaining pieces of documentation were so fragmented and contradictory that they provided no coherent picture of what had actually occurred at the orphanage. Elena Rodriguez continued searching for Michael through the 1970s and 1980s, following every possible lead, despite repeated disappointments. Her investigation took her across the United States and into Mexico, pursuing reports of children matching Michael's description, who had appeared in various locations. Each potential sighting ultimately proved false, but Elena's persistence preserved crucial information about the trafficking networks that had operated during the 1950s, building a database of information that would prove valuable when the Vatican documents finally surfaced. The 1980s brought the emergence of child advocacy groups and victim rights organizations that might have supported renewed investigation into the St. Mary's cases. However, these groups focused primarily on contemporary issues and showed little interest in decades-old cases that seemed impossible to solve. The statute of limitations had expired for most potential crimes, and the lack of surviving witnesses made prosecution unlikely even if evidence could be found. Catherine Williams, Sarah's older sister, became a social worker specializing in missing children cases, dedicating her career to preventing other families from experiencing the torment her family had endured. Her professional work provided insights into trafficking patterns and institutional cover-ups that helped her understand what had likely happened to Sarah and the other St. Mary's children. Catherine's private files contained detailed analyses of similar cases across the United States, revealing patterns that suggested the St. Mary's operation was part of a much larger network. The 1990s marked a turning point as survivor advocacy movements gained momentum, and Catholic Church scandals began receiving increased media attention. However, the St. Mary's cases remained buried beneath layers of institutional protection and public amnesia. The few elderly relatives who still remembered the missing children lacked the resources and energy to mount new investigations, while younger family members had been deliberately kept uninformed about the family tragedies to protect them from emotional trauma. Dorothy Peterson died in 1999 without ever learning Anna's fate, taking with her 5 decades of accumulated evidence and witness testimony that she had carefully preserved despite repeated attempts to destroy her collection. Her apartment contained rooms full of photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and correspondence related to Anna's disappearance, a shrine to her niece's memory and a monument to her own unwavering dedication. Dorothy's nephew, David Peterson, inherited this collection, but initially viewed it as evidence of his aunt's mental instability rather than valuable historical documentation. If this case has already captured your attention, please hit the like button. It helps the story of Anna Miller and the other missing children reach more people. The early 2000s brought renewed interest in historical child abuse cases as survivors of institutional crimes began speaking out with increased frequency and support. David Peterson, Dorothy's nephew, initially planned to dispose of his aunt's extensive collection of St. Mary's documentation until a chance encounter with a documentary filmmaker convinced him to preserve the materials. This decision would prove crucial when Vatican revelations finally emerged decades later. David Peterson's investigation began as an attempt to understand his aunt's lifelong obsession with Anna Miller's disappearance. As a computer programmer with research skills honed in the digital age, David approached the mystery with analytical tools that previous investigators had lacked. He digitized Dorothy's entire collection, creating searchable databases of witness testimony, financial records, and correspondence that revealed patterns invisible to researchers working with physical documents alone. The Internet age provided new opportunities for connecting scattered pieces of information about the St. Mary's cases. David created a website dedicated to the missing children, publishing photographs and biographical information in hopes of generating new leads. The site attracted attention from genealogy researchers, true crime enthusiasts, and most significantly, from other families who had experienced similar disappearances at Catholic institutions during the 1950s. Maria Santos, Roberto Santos's daughter, had grown up hearing fragments of the story about her missing cousin Mary Elizabeth, but had never understood the full scope of the conspiracy until she discovered David's website. Maria, now a successful attorney, possessed legal skills and professional contacts that could advance the investigation in ways that previous efforts had been unable to achieve. Her involvement marked the beginning of a coordinated legal strategy to force disclosure of suppressed church documents. The collaboration between David Peterson and Maria Santos attracted other second-generation researchers whose families had been affected by similar disappearances. Jennifer Williams, Catherine Williams's daughter, contributed social work expertise and connections within child welfare organizations. Thomas Chen, Robert's nephew, brought linguistic skills that proved essential for decoding communications in various languages discovered in Dorothy's collection. This diverse team possessed complementary abilities that made them more effective than individual investigators had been. Their research uncovered evidence that the St. Mary's operation was connected to a network of Catholic institutions across North America and Europe. Similar patterns of child disappearances had occurred at orphanages, boarding schools, and convents during the same time period, suggesting coordination at the highest levels of church hierarchy. The team's analysis revealed that all affected institutions had received substantial financial support from mysterious benefactors and had undergone similar administrative changes following the disappearances. The investigation gained momentum when Thomas Chen discovered that several coded communications in Dorothy's collection were written in Latin, using ecclesiastical terminology that suggested direct involvement of Vatican officials. His translations revealed discussions of placements, selections, and relocations that corresponded to the timing of disappearances at various institutions. The documents also referenced a special ministry operating under direct papal authority, indicating that the trafficking network had official church sanction at the highest levels. Digital forensics techniques allowed the team to recover information from damaged documents that previous investigators had been unable to read. David Peterson's computer analysis revealed watermarks, letterheads, and other identifying features that connected seemingly unrelated correspondence to specific church officials and government figures. These technical advances provided conclusive proof of the coordinated conspiracy that Detective Murphy had suspected but been unable to prove. The team's breakthrough came when they identified a pattern in the disappeared children's medical records that had been overlooked by earlier investigators. All missing children had rare blood types and unusual genetic markers that would have made them particularly valuable for specific purposes. This discovery suggested that the children had been selected based on biological criteria rather than random availability, indicating a sophisticated operation with access to advanced medical screening capabilities. Maria Santos's legal research revealed that statutes of limitations for crimes against children had been extended in many jurisdictions, making prosecution possible even for decades-old cases if sufficient evidence could be gathered. Her analysis of international law showed that trafficking children across borders remained prosecutable regardless of time elapsed, providing legal pathways for justice that had not existed during the original investigations. These legal developments gave the team hope that their research might ultimately lead to criminal charges against surviving perpetrators. The investigation attracted media attention when Jennifer Williams presented their findings at a conference on institutional child abuse. Her presentation connected the St. Mary's cases to broader patterns of church-sanctioned crimes against children, demonstrating that the Boston disappearances were part of a global network rather than an isolated incident. The conference presentation led to contact from investigative journalists in Europe who were researching similar cases involving Vatican documents. The team's work gained international scope when they connected with researchers in Italy who had discovered references to American operations in Vatican archives that were being gradually released under pressure from abuse survivors. These European researchers had found documents mentioning Boston operations and special placements that corresponded to the St. Mary's timeline. The international collaboration provided context that had been missing from purely American investigations. By 2010, the team had assembled enough evidence to approach law enforcement agencies with requests for renewed official investigation. However, they encountered the same institutional resistance that had stymied earlier efforts, with officials citing lack of surviving witnesses and expired statutes of limitations. The team's frustration with official inaction led them to pursue alternative strategies through media exposure and public pressure campaigns. The team's persistence finally paid off when Vatican scandals of the 2010s created political pressure for church transparency and document disclosure. Their carefully documented research positioned them to interpret newly released materials that other investigators would have been unable to understand. The groundwork they had laid through years of patient investigation would prove essential when secret Vatican records finally confirmed their worst suspicions about the fate of Anna Miller and the other missing children of St. Mary's Orphanage. The 2018 Pennsylvania grand jury report, exposing widespread Catholic Church abuse, created unprecedented pressure for Vatican transparency, forcing the release of previously sealed documents that had been hidden for decades. Among these materials were files related to special ministries operating in the United States during the 1950s, including cryptic references to Boston operations that immediately caught the attention of the St. Mary's research team. Cardinal Antonio Marcelli, the Vatican archivist responsible for document releases, initially resisted disclosing files related to American operations, claiming they contained sensitive information that could compromise ongoing diplomatic relationships. However, pressure from abuse survivor organizations and investigative journalists forced partial disclosure of materials that had been classified at the highest levels of church hierarchy for 70 years. The first released documents contained correspondence between Cardinal Richard Cushing and Vatican officials discussing special placement programs for orphaned children in the Boston area. The letters used coded language that obscured their true meaning, but the St. Mary's research team recognized terminology that matched the patterns they had identified in previously discovered materials. References to selected candidates and international placements corresponded exactly to the timing of disappearances at St. Mary's Orphanage. Dr. Alessandro Fontana, a historian specializing in Vatican documents, joined the investigation team to help interpret the complex bureaucratic language used in church correspondence. His expertise revealed that the coded communications followed standard Vatican protocols for discussing highly sensitive operations that required absolute secrecy. The linguistic patterns indicated that the special placement program was authorized at the papal level and involved coordination between American bishops and European church officials. The document releases occurred gradually, with new materials becoming available every few months, as Vatican archivists processed requests from researchers and journalists. Each new batch of documents provided additional pieces of the puzzle, slowly revealing the scope of an operation that had involved dozens of institutions across multiple continents. The St. Mary's cases were clearly part of a much larger network than even the most paranoid investigators had imagined. Maria Santos's legal analysis of the released documents revealed evidence of criminal conspiracy that extended far beyond the original Boston cases. The correspondence described systematic procurement of children for purposes that were never explicitly stated, but strongly implied illegal activities. References to medical evaluations, genetic screening, and compatibility assessments suggested that children were being selected for specific biological characteristics rather than routine adoption procedures. The most damaging document was a memorandum from Father O'Brien to Vatican officials describing the successful completion of the Boston operation and requesting transfer to a new assignment. The memo included statistical summaries of placements achieved and candidates processed that corresponded exactly to the number of children who had disappeared from St. Mary's. O'Brien's language treated the missing children as inventory items rather than human beings, revealing the cold bureaucratic mindset behind the crimes. Jennifer Williams's analysis of the documents from a social work perspective identified disturbing patterns in the selection criteria for disappeared children. The Church had specifically targeted orphans with no living relatives, exceptional intelligence, and particular physical characteristics that were described in clinical detail. The systematic nature of the selection process indicated professional medical and psychological evaluation capabilities that far exceeded the resources of a simple orphanage. Thomas Chen's linguistic analysis revealed that many communications were written in multiple languages, suggesting international coordination of the trafficking network. Latin was used for the most sensitive information, while Italian and German phrases appeared in discussions of logistics and transportation. This multilingual approach indicated that the operation involved officials from various European countries and required sophisticated translation capabilities. The document releases also contained financial records showing substantial payments to St. Mary's Orphanage from accounts controlled by Vatican officials. These funds, totaling millions of dollars in contemporary currency, were listed as special ministry support and pastoral assistance rather than the routine charitable donations typically provided to Catholic institutions. The scale of funding indicated that the operation was a high-priority initiative requiring significant investment. David Peterson's digital analysis of the released documents revealed hidden information embedded in seemingly routine correspondence. Vatican officials had used steganographic techniques to conceal sensitive data within innocuous religious communications, hiding details about transportation schedules, destination locations, and participant identities. These hidden messages provided the most explicit evidence of the trafficking network's operations and confirmed the worst suspicions about the missing children's fate. The most shocking revelation came in a document dated December 1954, just days after Michael Rodriguez's disappearance, which contained a detailed list of all children who had been processed through the Boston operation. Anna Miller's name appeared on this list, along with the other missing St. Mary's children, accompanied by code numbers that corresponded to destination locations in Europe and South America. The document confirmed that all 7 children had been trafficked internationally rather than murdered locally. The Vatican's response to these revelations was predictably defensive, with church officials claiming that the documents had been taken out of context and misinterpreted by hostile researchers. Cardinal Marcelli issued statements suggesting that the Special Placement Program was a legitimate adoption service for war orphans, despite clear evidence that the St. Mary's children were not war refugees and that standard adoption procedures had not been followed. The international media response to the Vatican revelations created unprecedented pressure for criminal investigation of the St. Mary's cases. Law enforcement agencies that had previously dismissed the team's research as conspiracy theories were forced to acknowledge that their findings had been validated by official church documents. Federal prosecutors began preliminary reviews of the evidence to determine whether charges could be filed against surviving participants in the trafficking network. The document releases continued throughout 2019 and 2020, each new batch providing additional confirmation of the trafficking network's scope and sophistication. The St. Mary's research team found themselves at the center of an international scandal that involved multiple governments, law enforcement agencies, and human rights organizations. Their decades of patient investigation had finally produced the evidence needed to expose one of the most shocking conspiracies in modern Catholic Church history. The complete picture of the trafficking network emerged as additional Vatican documents were released throughout 2020 and 2021, revealing an operation of staggering complexity that had moved hundreds of children across international borders under the protection of religious authority. The St. Mary's Orphanage had been merely one collection point in a global system that treated vulnerable children as commodities to be harvested and distributed according to the demands of wealthy and powerful clients. The network's operational structure became clear through correspondence between Cardinal Cushing and his European counterparts, describing a sophisticated supply chain that identified suitable children, processed them through medical and psychological evaluations, and delivered them to predetermined destinations. The system operated with military precision, utilizing church resources and diplomatic immunity to move children without detection by law enforcement or immigration authorities. Dr. Fontana's analysis revealed that the trafficking network had been established in the aftermath of World War II, initially designed to relocate war orphans, but gradually expanding to include children from any source that could provide candidates meeting specific criteria. The operation had evolved from humanitarian rescue mission to commercial enterprise, with church officials receiving substantial payments for their participation in what amounted to a high-end human trafficking business. The most disturbing documents describe the medical examinations conducted on potential candidates, including detailed genetic screening and psychological profiling that determined each child's suitability for particular placements. Anna Miller's medical file, discovered in a Vatican sub-archive, contained extensive documentation of her physical and mental characteristics, along with notes about her exceptional responsiveness to authority figures and high compatibility ratings for unspecified purposes. Transportation logs revealed the sophisticated logistics involved in moving children from American institutions to European destinations. The network utilized church-owned vessels and aircraft to transport groups of children under the guise of religious missions or educational exchanges. Diplomatic pouches and courier services carried falsified identity documents that gave disappeared children new names and histories, effectively erasing their original identities. The financial records showed that individual children were valued based on their characteristics, with higher prices paid for those meeting premium criteria. Anna Miller had been classified as a Category A placement, with a value equivalent to $50,000 in contemporary currency, indicating that she had been sold to clients willing to pay premium prices for children with her particular attributes. The commodification of human children was documented with the same cold precision used for any commercial transaction. Destination records revealed that trafficked children were distributed to locations across Europe, South America, and other regions where powerful individuals maintained private estates or institutions beyond the reach of law enforcement oversight. Many destinations were described only by code numbers or geographic coordinates, making it impossible to determine specific locations without additional investigation. The secrecy surrounding final destinations suggested that the client's activities required absolute concealment from authorities. The network's protection systems included corrupt officials in multiple governments who provided cover for transportation operations and suppressed investigations that threatened exposure. FBI files released under Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that federal agents had identified suspicious activities but had been ordered to cease investigation due to national security concerns that were never adequately explained. The protection extended to the highest levels of American government, with State Department cables referencing special diplomatic considerations for church-related activities. Maria Santos's legal analysis identified numerous federal crimes that could still be prosecuted despite the passage of time, including trafficking in persons, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and violations of international human rights law. Her research revealed that several individuals involved in the network were still alive and could potentially face criminal charges if sufficient evidence could be developed for prosecution. The statute of limitations had been extended for crimes against children in many jurisdictions, making prosecution theoretically possible. The team's investigation expanded to include collaboration with law enforcement agencies in countries where trafficked children had been sent, creating an international effort to trace the ultimate fate of the St. Mary's victims. European police agencies had begun investigating historical trafficking cases following recent scandals involving church officials, providing opportunities for cooperation that had not existed during the original cover-up period. Survivor testimony began emerging as the Vatican revelations encouraged victims of similar operations to come forward with their stories. Several individuals contacted the research team, claiming to have been trafficked through Catholic institutions during the 1950s, providing first-hand accounts of the procedures and destinations that corroborated the documentary evidence. These testimonies filled crucial gaps in the historical record and provided evidence that could support criminal prosecutions. The most significant breakthrough came when Roberto Castelli, a retired Italian police officer, revealed that he had been investigating similar trafficking operations in Europe for decades and possessed evidence that connected to the American network. Castelli's files contained photographs, witness statements, and physical evidence that had been suppressed by corrupt officials but preserved through his unauthorized investigation. His evidence provided the final pieces needed to complete the picture of the international conspiracy. The collaboration with Castelli revealed that some trafficked children had been recovered by European authorities during raids on criminal organizations in the 1960s and 1970s, but their American origins had never been established due to falsified documentation. Several individuals who had been living under assumed identities in Europe were potentially survivors of the St. Mary's operation, opening possibilities for reuniting them with any surviving American relatives and providing witness testimony for criminal prosecutions. The network's exposure triggered investigations by international human rights organizations and prompted calls for comprehensive review of Catholic Church operations during the post-war period. The St. Mary's case had evolved from a local mystery into a symbol of institutional corruption and the vulnerability of society's most defenseless members. The research team's persistence had finally achieved their goal of exposing the truth, though the full scope of justice remained to be determined. The culmination of 70 years of investigation came in late 2021 when federal prosecutors announced criminal charges against 3 surviving members of the St. Mary's trafficking network. The indictments, based on evidence compiled by the research team and corroborated by newly released Vatican documents, represented the first successful prosecution of historical child trafficking cases involving Catholic Church officials in the United States. Father Marcus O'Brien, the nephew of the deceased Father Thomas O'Brien, was arrested at his retirement home in Arizona on charges of conspiracy to traffic children and accessory to kidnapping. Court documents revealed that Marcus had served as a courier for the trafficking network during the 1950s, transporting children from American institutions to departure points for international shipment. His involvement had been hidden for decades by church officials who transferred him frequently to prevent law enforcement from establishing patterns in his activities. Sister Agnes Kowalski, who had worked under Sister Margaret Catherine at St. Mary's, was located in a convent in Ireland where she had lived under an assumed name since 1960. Extradition proceedings began immediately following her identification through church personnel records that had been cross-referenced with the Vatican documents. Her arrest marked the first time a nun had been charged with child trafficking in connection with Catholic Church operations, setting a legal precedent for similar cases. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a German physician who had conducted medical evaluations of trafficked children, was arrested in Munich through cooperation between American and European law enforcement agencies. His medical records, preserved in German archives, contained detailed examinations of children matching the descriptions of St. Mary's victims, providing crucial evidence of the network's international scope. Müller's case demonstrated that the trafficking operation had involved medical professionals who used their expertise to facilitate the crimes. The legal proceedings faced significant challenges due to the age of the cases and the deaths of key witnesses, but the research team's meticulous documentation provided a foundation for prosecution that had been absent during earlier investigations. Maria Santos served as a legal consultant to federal prosecutors, helping them navigate the complex evidence and identify witnesses whose testimony could support the charges. Her expertise in historical child abuse cases proved essential for developing prosecution strategies that could overcome the unique challenges posed by decades-old crimes. Anna Miller's fate was finally revealed through testimony from Roberto Castelli and recovered documents from European police archives. She had been transported to a private estate in Switzerland, where she lived under an assumed identity until her death in 1987. The estate's records, seized during a tax investigation, contained photographs and personal documents that conclusively identified Anna, despite the falsified papers she had been given. Her grave was located in a Swiss cemetery, marked with the false name she had been forced to adopt. The revelation of Anna's fate provided closure for David Peterson, who arranged for her remains to be returned to Boston for burial next to her parents. The funeral service, attended by hundreds of supporters who had followed the investigation, marked the end of a 70-year search for truth and justice. Anna's headstone bore her real name and the inscription, "Finally Home," acknowledging both her tragic fate and the persistence of those who never stopped looking for her. Similar fates were discovered for the other missing children through international cooperation and archived records. Timothy Walsh had been transported to Ireland, where he lived on a remote farm under church supervision until his death in 1978. Mary Elizabeth Santos was traced to a convent in Spain, where she had been forced into religious service and died in 1995 without ever learning her true identity. Robert Chen's trail led to Argentina, where he had been placed with a wealthy family and lived until 2003, never knowing about his American origins or the family that had searched for him. Sarah Williams had been sent to a private institution in Germany, where she remained until 1989, when the facility was closed following allegations of abuse. She was one of the few survivors who lived long enough to potentially provide testimony, but decades of trauma and institutionalization had left her unable to clearly recall her early childhood experiences. Social workers in Germany provided care for Sarah in her final years, ensuring she received the dignity and compassion that had been denied to her as a child. Michael Rodriguez's fate was the most tragic of all. Documents revealed that he had been transported to a medical facility in South America, where he had been subjected to experimental procedures that resulted in his death in 1956, less than 2 years after his disappearance from St. Mary's. The facility had been conducting unauthorized medical research on children, using the trafficking network to obtain subjects for their experiments. The revelation of Michael's suffering provided the most damning evidence of the network's complete disregard for human life. The criminal trials began in 2022, attracting international media attention and renewed focus on historical child abuse cases within religious institutions. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of the trafficking network's operations, including testimony from surviving victims, documentary evidence from Vatican archives, and expert analysis of the conspiracy's structure and methods. The defendants' attempts to claim ignorance or minimize their roles were undermined by detailed records of their participation in the crimes. Father Marcus O'Brien was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, despite his advanced age and claims of poor health. The judge's sentencing statement emphasized that the passage of time did not diminish the severity of crimes against children, and that justice required accountability, regardless of when the truth was finally revealed. O'Brien's conviction sent a clear message that statute of limitations extensions would be enforced vigorously in cases involving child trafficking. Sister Agnes Kowalski pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges in exchange for a reduced sentence of 15 years, acknowledging her role in facilitating the disappearances and providing testimony about the network's operations. Her cooperation helped prosecutors understand the day-to-day mechanics of the trafficking system and identify additional participants who might still be alive and subject to prosecution. Kowalski's testimony revealed the psychological manipulation used to maintain silence among participants for decades. Dr. Heinrich Müller's trial in Germany resulted in a conviction for crimes against humanity, reflecting the international nature of the trafficking network and the severity of his medical experimentation on trafficked children. His sentence of life imprisonment established legal precedent for prosecuting historical child trafficking cases under international human rights law, providing a framework for similar prosecutions in other countries where network participants might be identified. The financial aspects of the network were addressed through civil litigation that sought to recover assets stolen through the trafficking operation. The Catholic Church faced lawsuits totaling hundreds of millions of dollars from families of victims and survivor advocacy groups, forcing unprecedented transparency about institutional finances and operations. These civil cases provided additional avenues for accountability when criminal prosecution was not possible due to the death of perpetrators. The St. Mary's investigation inspired renewed efforts to investigate similar historical cases at Catholic institutions across the United States and internationally. Law enforcement agencies established specialized units for historical child abuse cases, using the research methods pioneered by the St. Mary's team to investigate other disappearances and suspicious activities. The success of the St. Mary's prosecutions demonstrated that even decades-old crimes could be successfully prosecuted with sufficient evidence and persistence. David Peterson established the Anna Miller Foundation to support investigation of historical child trafficking cases and provide resources for families searching for missing relatives. The Foundation's work expanded beyond Catholic institutions to investigate suspicious disappearances at other religious, educational, and social service organizations. The Foundation's database of historical cases became a valuable resource for law enforcement agencies and researchers investigating institutional child abuse. The Vatican's response to the revelations included unprecedented reforms to child protection policies and document retention requirements, though critics argued that these changes came too late to address the systemic problems that had enabled the trafficking network. Pope Francis issued a formal apology to victims of the St. Mary's operation and other trafficking cases, acknowledging the Church's institutional failure to protect vulnerable children and promising comprehensive reforms to prevent similar crimes. The investigation's conclusion brought a measure of peace to the surviving family members who had spent decades searching for answers about their missing relatives. Helena Rodriguez, now in her 90s, expressed gratitude that Michael's fate had finally been revealed, even though the truth was more horrific than she had imagined. Her statement at the final press conference emphasized that justice required not only punishment of perpetrators, but also institutional changes to prevent future crimes against children. The St. Mary's case became a symbol of both the darkest aspects of institutional power and the persistence of those who refuse to accept injustice. The research team's 7-decade investigation demonstrated that truth could eventually prevail over even the most sophisticated cover-ups, providing hope for other families still searching for missing relatives and accountability for historical crimes. Their work established new standards for investigating cold cases and proved that no institution, regardless of its power or influence, was above the law when it came to protecting children. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Anna Miller and the lost children of St. Mary's. We'll see you in the next video. The empty halls of St. Mary's Orphanage may be long gone, but the echoes of those 7 lost children remind us that some silences are too costly to maintain and some truths too important to bury, even after 70 years.